woman's voice cut through the cabin like ice. "Get up," she snapped at the young boy beside her. "I will not sit next to you. This seat isn't meant for people like you." The boy, quiet, respectful, and clearly startled, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Turning her shoulder toward him, the woman pulled out her phone and speed-dialed her friend. "Clara, you will not believe who they sat me next to on this flight," she muttered in a sharp tone. "They've clearly stopped vetting who they let into first class. There's a child next to me, a black one, and not even dressed halfway decently." She paused, glancing sideways just enough to make sure the boy could hear. "I paid good money to avoid situations like this, and now I'm basically being forced to babysit a little wild animal. Just my luck. But I'll make sure he doesn't enjoy this flight one bit." What Gillian Wakefield didn't know was that someone had been watching her from the moment she opened her mouth, and her words were about to ignite a storm she couldn't escape. No apology, no lie, and no money would undo what she just set in motion. In front of a plane full of smartphone-wielding passengers, justice was about to unfold. But to understand the weight of what was coming, we have to rewind 3 hours. To a busy Friday afternoon at Oak Ridge International Airport, where an 8-year-old boy named Micah Ellison was excitedly preparing to take a flight he'd never forget. Terminal C was bustling, filled with travelers dragging roller bags and checking gate numbers. Amid the movement stood Micah, his eyes full of wonder as he stared up at the glowing departure screens. While most kids his age might have been anxious, Micah stood tall with a calm maturity beyond his years. Micah wasn't just any kid. He was the son of Dominic Ellison, a hospitality mogul whose name carried weight in boardrooms around the world. Yet despite his father's fortune, Micah was dressed simply. A light blue collared shirt, neat tan pants, and well-worn sneakers. His father had always told him, "How you treat people matters more than what you wear." Beside Micah stood Grace, his nanny of nearly 4 years. She glanced at her phone with concern. "Your dad's running late, sweetheart," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "But he said he'll make it before the gate closes." Micah gave her a small nod. "I remember everything we packed," he said confidently. "My space book, my sketch pad, my headphones, and the no-spill juice boxes." Grace smiled, proud. He was mature for his age. This trip was a reward. After earning straight A's in his advanced science program, his father had given him a first-class ticket, a symbol of hard work paying off. It was a lesson Dominic lived by and passed on to his son, even though their family had more than enough. They walked together to the first-class lounge, where Micah's premium ticket granted them entry. He took in the soft lighting and quiet elegance of the room. But moments later, Grace's phone buzzed again, and this time, her face fell. "Oh no," she whispered. "Micah, I have to go. My sister's been in a car accident. They just rushed her to the hospital." Micah's eyes widened. "Is she okay?" "I don't know yet," she said, torn. "But I need to get to her right away. Your dad's close, I promise. Can you wait here until he boards?" Micah took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. "I can do it." "I'll be okay," he said, sounding older than his years. Grace gave him a tight hug, confirmed with Dominic that he was nearly at the gate, and hurried off. Micah sat quietly in the lounge, nose deep in his solar system book, unaware that a storm was approaching. Enter Gillian Wakefield. Everything about her was sharp. Her tone, her movements, even her sleek gray suit that probably cost more than a month's rent. As the senior vice president of Prestia Hotels, a rival to the Ellison chain, she thrived on control, and she expected everything around her to bend to her preferences. Her eyes landed on Micah, a child, in her lounge, her lips curled in distaste. Striding to the desk, she didn't bother lowering her voice. "Is that kid really flying first class?" she asked, pointing toward Micah. The lounge attendant nodded politely. Yes, ma'am, he has a valid boarding pass. Jillian scoffed. Unbelievable. First class isn't what it used to be. Micah kept reading, but his hands gripped the pages just a little tighter. What neither he nor Jillian knew was that fate had seated them next to each other on the flight, and that the boy she just insulted wasn't alone after all. The woman's voice sliced through the quiet of the lounge with cool disdain. "Is that child actually flying first class?" Gillian Wakefield asked, disbelief dripping from every syllable. Her tone carried more than just surprise. It carried judgment, the kind that cloaked itself in class but was rooted in something far more insidious. The gate agent looked up briefly from the computer, her professional expression unwavering as she glanced toward Micah Ellison, who sat a few feet away, half hidden behind the cover of his spacebook. "Yes, ma'am," she replied evenly. "He holds a confirmed first-class ticket." Jillian's brows lifted sharply. "Seriously? And he's what? 7? "I can't say, ma'am," the agent responded coolly. "But everything's in order." Jillian scoffed under her breath. "They really do let anyone in these days," she muttered, loudly enough for both the agent and Micah to hear. "First class used to mean something." Micah didn't look up, but his hands gripped the edges of his book a little tighter. He wasn't new to this. His father had warned him that some people wore their hate like perfume, subtle, but always noticeable. Jillian slinked to a chair on the far side of the lounge, casting occasional glances in Micah's direction, as though his presence alone disturbed the delicate ambiance she believed was reserved for people like her. When the boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, she stood abruptly, gathering her designer tote with tight, exasperated motions. At the same moment, Micah sent a quick message to his father. "They're boarding now. Are you close?" The reply came almost instantly. "Stuck in traffic. Go ahead and board. I'll be there before they close the doors." "Proud of you, champ." Micah took a breath and stepped into the priority lane, directly behind Jillian. He could feel her eyes on him. Cold, calculating, judging. The boarding agent greeted him warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Ellison. Enjoy your flight." The cabin glowed with soft lights and polished finishes. First class always felt special to Micah, but never something he took for granted. That was one of the first things his dad had taught him. Luxury means nothing if you don't treat people with respect. He found his seat, 3A by the window, and slid his backpack carefully under the seat in front of him. His eyes sparkled as he sat down, opening his book to the chapter about planetary rings. He dreamed of space, not for escape, but for exploration. He didn't need to work for a living, but he wanted to matter. That was something his dad had made clear. Legacy is earned, not inherited. But his peaceful moment ended abruptly. A shadow loomed beside him, Gillian Wakefield. She stopped in the aisle, eyes flicking between the seat number above and Micah, realization dawning in her expression like sour milk turning in the sun. "You've got to be kidding me," she hissed. She flagged down a flight attendant, Elna, according to her badge, with a flick of her manicured fingers. "There's been a mistake with my seat," she said, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough to spare Micah from hearing. "I didn't pay over $3,000 to sit next to a child." Elna responded with a tight-lipped smile, her professionalism unfazed. "Let me check on that for you," Jillian added, with a glance toward Micah and a venomous tone. "Especially that kind of child." The implication was razor-sharp, and Elena, seasoned in dealing with ugliness behind smiles, gave the slightest flicker of disapproval behind her eyes. "I understand, ma'am," she said evenly, "but the flight is completely full. There are no other seats in first class." "What about business class?" Jillian asked quickly, her voice rising. "I'd rather move than—" She trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward Micah. "We're at full capacity across all cabins," Helena replied, polite but firm. You're welcome to speak with the gate agent about taking a later flight." "That's not an option," Gillian snapped, glancing at her watch. "I have a boardroom meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. With an exasperated breath, she reluctantly sank into seat 3B, clearly making an effort to lean as far away from Micah as possible, like even the air around him offended her. Micah stayed still, trying to keep his breathing even. The corners of his mouth turned down just slightly. Still, his dad had raised him to be respectful, even when others weren't. So he turned, his voice soft but steady. "Hi, ma'am. I'm Micah. Nice to meet you." He held out a small hand. Jillian looked at it the way one might look at a dirty napkin. Her eyes scanned his face, filled with a contempt that didn't bother hiding itself. Passengers nearby began to shift uncomfortably, picking up on the unease in the air. "Listen," she said coldly. "Kids like you shouldn't be up here. You belong in the back." The words hit like a slap. Micah's hands slowly retreated. His expression didn't crumble, not completely, but something behind his eyes dimmed. He didn't reply. He just turned toward the window, eyes fixed outside, wishing the clouds could carry him far away from the tension beside him. He'd been here before, but somehow it never hurt less. And somewhere behind them, a man was preparing to board. A man who would change everything. Micah slowly lowered his hand. The warmth of his greeting met only with icy contempt. The hope that had lit his face moments earlier dissolved into a composed, guarded expression, one he had worn before. He had been taught that not everyone would treat him fairly, but that didn't soften the sting. Across the aisle, an elderly woman let out an audible gasp. A man seated one row ahead turned sharply, eyes narrowed. Yet, as often happens in these moments, no one said a word. The silence allowed the cruelty to settle, unchallenged. Micah turned back to the window, watching airport ground crews bustle around below, focusing intently, as though the movement outside might calm the storm building beside him. Next to him, Gillian Wakefield placed a pair of sleek, futuristic headphones over her ears with performative flourish, as if she were erecting a wall between herself and what she saw as an unbearable inconvenience. She leaned back with exaggerated relief, making it clear she considered his presence an intrusion. Flight attendants moved down the aisle, offering pre-departure drinks. When Elena, the same attendant who had dealt with Jillian earlier, reached their row, she offered a kind smile to Micah. "Would you like some apple juice, young man?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. Micah nodded politely. "Yes, please, thank you." Before Elena could even turn to pour, Jillian cut in without removing her headphones. "Make sure he doesn't spill it. I'm wearing Belamonte, and it's not dry cleanable." Elena's smile cooled just slightly. She handed Micah his drink in a spill-proof cup meant for younger flyers. "I'm sure he'll be fine." "He seems quite responsible," she said, her voice edged with subtle defiance. But Jillian, already absorbed in her emails, missed the pointed jab entirely. Micah's phone buzzed, a message from his dad. "Boarding now. Barely made it. Be there in 2 minutes." A small smile curved Micah's lips. Just a little longer, and his dad would be here. Everything felt better when Dominic Ellison was nearby. He had a way of making the air safer. Micah sipped his juice carefully and reopened his book, trying to keep his focus steady until the moment Dominic arrived. As the final passengers boarded, Jillian's irritation grew thicker, her posture stiff with judgment, her arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched. She glanced repeatedly toward the cabin door, her entire body a study in growing discontent. Micah kept sneaking glances toward the entrance, too, but for a different reason. His shoulders were inching higher, his frame more rigid with every passing second, absorbing Jillian's disdain like a sponge. Then, with the final call announcement still moments away, Jillian pulled out her phone again, using the last window of time to make another complaint. "Clara," she hissed, "you won't believe this. I'm still stuck next to him. I'm calling corporate the moment we land. This is absurd." Micah tried to shrink himself, curling inward, arms drawn close, knees together, his back pressed against the seat. He looked so small. It was hard to believe this was the same confident kid who'd proudly listed off his travel checklist just an hour ago. Another flight attendant, a man named Jonas, walked by and noticed the clear imbalance in the row. He approached, gentle but firm. "Ma'am," he said to Jillian, "we'll be closing the cabin door shortly. Please switch your phone to airplane mode." Jillian waved him off with barely concealed annoyance. Yes, fine. "Just finishing up," she said into her phone. "No, Clara, seriously. Babysitting. It's a joke." When she finally ended the call, she turned to Jonas with a theatrical sigh. "I cannot believe this airline puts paying customers in this position. Isn't there anywhere else I could be seated?" Jonas glanced subtly at Micah, who sat still, eyes low, his presence unobtrusive but deeply affected. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Jonas said. "The flight is entirely booked, as my colleague mentioned. But," he shifted slightly, turning fully to Micah, "would you like some snacks, young man? We have a few special cookies that aren't usually on domestic flights." Micah blinked in surprise. "Yes, please," he said, his voice soft but grateful. Jonas gave him a reassuring smile. "I'll bring them to you once we're at cruising altitude." Then, turning back to Jillian, his face stiffened. "Is there anything else I can get for you, ma'am?" Her lips thinned into a tight line. "Just some peace and quiet would be nice," she muttered, casting a pointed glare at Micah, as if he'd been disturbing her when he had been silent the entire time. Jonas gave a curt nod and moved away just as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are third in line for takeoff. Please fasten your seat belts and prepare for departure." Micah's eyes flicked toward the door one last time. Still no sign of his dad. His heart sank. Dominic hadn't made it after all. He reached for his phone out of habit, wanting to send another message. But the flight crew was already moving down the aisles, ensuring all devices were powered down. Jillian leaned back into her seat, a smirk of satisfaction tugging at her lips. Micah looked out the window again. He was alone. But not for long. Micah reached for his phone, hoping for a message, something from his father to anchor him. But the cabin crew was already moving through, reminding everyone to switch their devices to airplane mode. He hesitated, then placed it back into his seat pocket with a quiet sigh. The reality hit him. He was on his own, seated beside a stranger who had made it clear with every word, glance, and sigh that he was unwelcome. Gillian Wakefield made a loud show of checking her watch, releasing a theatrical sigh of inconvenience. Then, with flair, she reclined her seat as far back as the cabin rules allowed, another petty claim of space in their quiet battle. Just then, Jonas, the kind flight attendant, returned as promised, carrying a small packet wrapped in gold foil. "These are my favorites," he said with a wink, handing the treats to Micah. "Usually only served on our international routes." Micah smiled, the corners of his lips lifting in genuine appreciation. "Thank you," he said softly. Jillian rolled her eyes as she waved down another attendant. She didn't want cookies. She wanted champagne. "Something strong to survive this flight," she muttered without shame, gesturing toward Micah. For a little while, calm returned to the cabin. Micah quietly read his book and carefully nibbled on the cookies, taking extra care not to spill even a crumb. He stayed firmly within his own space, head down, mind elsewhere. Across from him, Jillian alternated between checking emails and shooting him glares that seemed to question his very existence in that seat. About 45 minutes into the flight, the captain's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a patch of turbulence. I've turned on the seatbelt sign. Please return to your seats and buckle up." Jillian had just stepped out to use the restroom. Micah, already strapped in, didn't look up. He kept his eyes on his book, flipping through diagrams of planets and galaxies. When Jillian returned, she looked rattled. The light jostling of the plane had clearly irritated her further, and what she saw upon arriving at her seat only fueled her anger. The edge of Micah's small backpack had shifted slightly during the turbulence, brushing into her side of the shared footspace. His book lay open, tilted slightly on the tray, part of it grazing the divide between their seats. Her reaction was immediate and unnecessarily harsh. She grabbed the book and backpack roughly, shoving them both toward him. "Keep your things on your side," she snapped, her voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby rows. The book tumbled from Micah's lap, hitting the cabin floor. His backpack, barely nudging into her space, now crumpled against the window. "I'm sorry," Micah murmured, reaching to retrieve his belongings. His eyes were low, his voice barely above a whisper. He picked up the book and smoothed its creased pages, trying not to show how much it bothered him. But Jillian wasn't finished. She leaned closer, her voice a cruel whisper meant for him alone. "Let me guess. No one ever taught you manners. Figures." The final word, figures, hung in the air like smoke after a firework. A word soaked in judgment, heavy with something far uglier than frustration. Micah's face remained still, composed even, but his hands trembled as he carefully pressed the bent corner of his book, hoping no one had noticed. One row behind them, a seat remained empty, the one Dominic Ellison had originally booked. It seemed, for all Micah knew, his father hadn't made the flight. He was truly alone. A flight attendant passed by and noticed Micah's red-rimmed eyes. Misreading the situation, she leaned down with a kind expression and handed him a tissue. He took it politely, nodding his thanks. Across the row, Jillian sat smugly upright, pleased with herself, as if she'd restored order to some system that existed only in her mind. But what she didn't know, what none of the nearby passengers realized just yet, was that the storm brewing wasn't just overhead. A quiet shift occurred near the front of the cabin. The boarding door, which had been sealed minutes ago, opened again. There was a commotion, brief, respectful, but unmistakable. And then came Dominic Ellison. Dressed in a charcoal suit, his shirt crisp despite the rush, Dominic entered with quiet authority, escorted by the lead flight attendant. His presence instantly drew attention. He didn't need to speak loudly or carry himself boastfully. His posture, his calm, and the way people responded to him said it all. "We appreciate you holding the flight," he told the captain, his voice rich and composed. The highway was a nightmare. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, his eyes scanned for his son. He spotted Micah by the window. Relief passed over Dominic's face, followed by a furrow in his brow. He noticed immediately that something was off. Micah's posture was too rigid. His small frame seemed folded in on itself, and the woman seated beside him, she radiated a smug, dismissive energy that put Dominic on alert. He checked his boarding pass. Due to his delay, his seat had been moved. He was now sitting directly behind his son and Gillian Wakefield. Without a word, he slipped into the seat, unnoticed by either of them. Dominic placed his noise-canceling headphones over his ears and opened his tablet, appearing calm. But every so often, his eyes lifted to glance at Micah's reflection in the window. Something wasn't right, and it wouldn't take long before he found out just how wrong it truly was. The steady hum of the aircraft blended with the clinks of glassware as the cabin crew began their beverage service. In row 3, Micah looked up from his book when the cart arrived. "I'll have some apple juice, please," he said politely. Gillian Wakefield, still reclined beside him, removed her headphones just long enough to bark. Sparkling water. Glass, not plastic. Moments later, both drinks were delivered. Micah carefully placed his cup on the tray, double-checking that it was balanced, just as his father had taught him. Be thoughtful in every detail. But then, without warning, the plane hit a sharp pocket of turbulence. There was a jolt. Micah's juice, despite his caution, slid across the tray and tipped. Most of it splashed onto his lap and tray, but a few drops, no more than a flick, landed on the sleeve of Jillian's designer suit. Micah gasped softly and immediately reached for his napkin. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said, eyes wide with concern, his voice steady despite the anxiety in his chest. "It spilled because of the turbulence. Please, use mine." It was a genuine, respectful gesture, a child doing his best to make things right over a minor, everyday accident. But Jillian's response was anything but reasonable. Her face twisted in rage. She looked down at the faint specks on her sleeve as if they had burned a hole through her fabric. "This is a $5,000 suit," she shouted, her voice slicing through the calm of the cabin. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You people never understand the value of anything." Those two words, "you people," hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A few stared outright. Others pretended not to hear, though it was impossible to ignore. Micah's hand, still holding the napkin out, began to tremble. "I said I was sorry, ma'am," he whispered, his voice smaller now, cracking under the weight of public humiliation. A tear glistened in the corner of his eye. "Sorry doesn't fix this," Jillian sneered. "You don't belong here. You never did." Then, in a moment so swift and jarring that it seemed unreal, she lifted her hand and struck Micah across the face. The slap echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Micah's head snapped to the side. His body stiffened, frozen in shock. He didn't cry out. A single tear slipped down his cheek as he slowly raised a trembling hand to the fresh red mark blooming on his face. The silence was deafening. A woman across the aisle gasped and covered her mouth. A man 2 rows back stood up halfway, unsure what to do, but clearly moved to act. Murmurs rippled across first class like a rising tide. Then something shifted. In the row behind them, Dominic Ellison calmly removed his noise-canceling headphones. His movements were slow, deliberate, controlled. Anyone who knew Dominic well would have recognized the warning in that stillness. It was the stillness before a storm. "She just hit that kid," someone whispered loudly. "I saw it. She actually hit him," another voice added. A young woman sitting beside Jillian had already pulled out her phone. She hadn't just seen the slap. She had filmed it. Flight attendants, now alert to the commotion, rushed toward the row. Meanwhile, Jillian sat stiffly upright, her mouth set in a smug line of self-righteousness. "He ruined my suit," she said to no one in particular, as if that somehow justified the violence. Her voice dripped with entitlement, with the confidence of someone used to getting away with anything. Micah sat motionless, one hand still to his cheek, his eyes downcast. His dignity, though battered, remained intact. And behind them, Dominic stood up. Not quickly, not angrily, just precisely. He slid his tablet into the seat pocket and stood to his full height, tall, commanding, quietly powerful. A man who didn't need to raise his voice to make a room listen. He stepped into the aisle, his gaze fixed on Jillian. The storm had arrived. With the measured grace of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be feared, Dominic Ellison stepped forward. There was no visible rage on his face, no yelling, no outburst. But his eyes. They locked on the back of Gillian Wakefield's head with a focus so intense, so unwavering, that braver people than her would have instinctively backed away. The quiet in the cabin turned heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Dominic stepped fully into view, standing beside row 3. Now, for the first time, both Jillian and Micah could see him clearly. His presence shifted the atmosphere entirely. Calm, towering, a force of nature wrapped in an expensive suit and quiet fury. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But it was devastating. "How dare you strike my son?" 6 words. That was all it took. Micah turned, eyes wide. "Dad," he breathed, his voice cracked with emotion. Just that one word, Dad, carried with it 1,000 things: relief, fear, hope, safety. Jillian, who had been practically vibrating with self-righteousness, turned to confront the interruption and froze. Her jaw slackened. Her eyes widened. Color drained from her face. It took only a second for recognition to set in. She wasn't staring at just any angry parent. She was staring at Dominic Ellison, business mogul, philanthropist, and one of the 50 wealthiest men in the country. The name on the towering building she'd passed every day on her way to work. The name that, in fact, owned the very hotel where she was scheduled to give a career-defining presentation the next morning. And she had just slapped his child across the face in front of a plane full of witnesses. "Mr. Ellison," she stammered, her voice barely audible now, stripped of all its earlier confidence. This is a huge misunderstanding." Dominic didn't look at her. He crouched beside his son instead, gently taking Micah's chin and turning his face. His hand was steady, but his shoulders were tight, his jaw locked. A deep red imprint marked Micah's cheek. Dominic's thumb brushed away the single tear that had escaped. His voice, when he spoke, was low and measured. "Are you okay, buddy?" Micah nodded slowly. "I'm okay now, Dad." Dominic stood again, straightening to his full 6'3". The charcoal suit couldn't hide the strength beneath it, the kind of strength that came from long mornings in the gym and longer decades in boardrooms. Jillian looked suddenly small in her seat. "I heard every word," Dominic said, now looking straight at her. "I heard you tell my son that he didn't belong, that his kind should stay in the back. I watched you humiliate him, demean him. And then I watched you hit him because of a little turbulence." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They hit harder because of how calm they were. A few passengers nodded silently. Others had their phones out, filming the confrontation, just as they had filmed the slap. Jillian looked cornered, panicked. "Those weren't my exact words," she said weakly. "You're missing the context." Dominic didn't blink. "Flight attendant," he said clearly, still not breaking eye contact with her. Jonas appeared almost immediately. "Yes, Mr. Ellison." "I'd like to speak to the air marshal," Dominic said. "A passenger has assaulted my underage son. I intend to file formal charges." That was when Jillian finally cracked. "You can't be serious," she blurted out, eyes wide with disbelief. "It was just a tap. Look, he ruined my suit." But Dominic wasn't swayed. He didn't even glance at her sleeve. By now, 2 more flight attendants had joined, along with the chief purser, responding to the disturbance that had gripped the entire cabin. Passengers in business class were peeking over the divider, straining to see what was unfolding. "We take any incident involving violence very seriously, sir," the chief purser said, her voice crisp and professional. "I've already notified the captain. The air marshal will meet us upon landing." And just like that, the shift was complete. From power player to pariah. Gillian Wakefield was no longer in control of the flight, or her future. "We'll need full statements from everyone involved," the chief purser announced firmly, "and any passengers who witnessed the incident." Almost immediately, a woman across the aisle raised her hand. Middle-aged, sharp-eyed, and clearly shaken, she pointed directly at Gillian Wakefield. "I saw everything." "That woman slapped the boy," she said loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "He apologized after a bit of juice spilled during turbulence, and she struck him." "She's been cruel to him since we boarded," added an older gentleman with silver hair and a navy blazer. "Made comments about him not belonging in first class. Disgraceful behavior." Jillian's eyes darted between her accusers, each word cutting deeper. Her face had drained of color, now bordering on gray. The full weight of what she'd done was finally sinking in. Her voice rose in defense, brittle and frantic. "This is getting out of hand." It was a misunderstanding. The child was disruptive for the entire flight. But Dominic Ellison didn't even flinch. He turned back to his son, his voice softening. "Micah," he said gently, "has she been treating you this way since the start of the flight?" Micah glanced briefly at Jillian, still hesitating. He was only 8, and even now, part of him didn't want to get anyone in trouble. "It's okay to tell the truth," Dominic assured him. "You didn't cause this." Micah took a breath, then nodded. "Yes, Dad. Since the beginning. I didn't say anything because I knew you were coming. I just thought I could wait." Dominic placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture full of reassurance and pride. "You did nothing wrong," he said clearly, his voice steady and protective. Then he turned his gaze back to Jillian, and the warmth disappeared from his face. Just then, a man in plain clothes stepped into the aisle, his ID badge flashing briefly. The air marshal. "I've been informed there's been an incident involving a minor," he said, scanning the row. Dominic nodded. "That's correct. This woman struck my son across the face. There are multiple witnesses, and I believe there's video evidence as well. I want her arrested when we land." Panic flooded Jillian's features. "Wait, please. You don't understand what this will do to me. My job. My career." The marshal remained stone-faced. "Perhaps you should have thought of that before laying hands on a child," he replied flatly. The young woman seated one row behind stepped forward. "I have it all on video," she said, holding up her phone. "From the moment she started shouting about her clothes, I recorded everything. I can send it to you right now." "Please do," the marshal responded. "And keep a backup copy. That recording will be important." Jillian's breathing had become shallow. She clutched her armrests as though they might keep her grounded, though her entire world was clearly crumbling. "Mr. Ellison, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I have a presentation tomorrow. This is a major deal for my company. Surely we can work this out, without involving the authorities." Dominic's expression didn't change. He looked at her the way he might look at a failing investment, an asset that had once had promise, now reduced to liability. "That option disappeared the moment you raised your hand to my son," he said coldly. "You made your choices. Now you face their consequences." The chief purser stepped back in. "Ma'am, we'll need to relocate you for the remainder of the flight. Mr. Ellison, we have a more private arrangement if you and your son would prefer." Dominic nodded. "Yes, thank you. He's been through enough." Jillian was escorted to the last row of business class, a move that felt symbolic, given how loudly she'd protested his presence in first class earlier. Her eyes darted wildly as passengers whispered, stared, or looked away in disgust. The cabin buzzed with hushed conversations. Phones were already out. Messages were being sent. Some passengers were Googling names. Others were checking social media. And online, the fire had already started. The young woman's video, titled "Woman Slaps Billionaire's Son on Flight," not realizing his father was right behind her, was already making its rounds. It had been posted just minutes ago. Within the hour, it would go viral. Dominic now sat beside Micah, who leaned into his side, emotionally spent. His father wrapped an arm around him. "I'm proud of how you carried yourself," Dominic said quietly. "And your mom would be too." Micah gave a small, tired smile. "She always said dignity can't be taken," he whispered, "only surrendered." Meanwhile, far behind them, Gillian Wakefield sat alone. Her phone vibrated violently with notifications, texts, emails, missed calls. One message, however, hit harder than the rest. From her boss. "Just saw the video. Is that really Dominic Ellison's son? Don't come in Monday. HR will be in touch." And just like that, her career, Her carefully manicured image, her authority, her status, began to crumble at 35,000 feet because she couldn't control her prejudice, because she couldn't control her temper. Justice had already begun its descent. Justice had been served at 35,000 feet. But for Gillian Wakefield, the consequences were only just beginning. This wasn't just a bad flight. It was the unraveling of the life she had so carefully curated. The first crack in the facade. A single moment of cruelty that had opened the door to a collapse far more devastating than she could ever have imagined. As the plane began its descent toward San Oro International Airport, the cabin felt changed. The air was different. The passengers, once strangers, now shared something unspoken. They had all witnessed injustice and its immediate backlash. The air marshal moved calmly from row to row, collecting statements, listening carefully as one passenger after another recounted what they had seen and heard. Testimonies came freely, clear, honest, and aligned. They spoke of Jillian's cutting remarks, of the way she sneered at Micah Ellison from the moment she saw him, of the growing hostility she directed at him without provocation, and then, of course, the slap, the sharp, echoing act that had silenced the cabin and ignited the fury of a father. Each account added weight to an already damning case. Jillian, now slouched in her reassigned seat at the back of business class, sat alone. No one made eye contact. The flight attendants offered her nothing more than the bare minimum, a glass of water, a safety check, while their warmth flowed only to other passengers. It was a fall from grace that felt biblical, from entitled executive to untouchable pariah, in the time it took to cross a continent. Meanwhile, Dominic had relocated to sit beside Micah. His arm rested gently around his son's shoulders, not possessive, but protective. Micah leaned into him quietly. Dominic tilted his head closer and spoke softly. "You know, you never have to let someone talk to you like that. Or touch you. Not ever." His words were meant for Micah, but others nearby heard them too. Micah looked up at him, his young face reflecting both hurt and clarity. "She said people like us don't belong in first class," he admitted quietly, trying to hide how much it had stung. Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "And that's why we carry ourselves with dignity, even when others don't. You showed more class than she ever could, and you never once lowered yourself to her level." Micah didn't reply, but the way he sat a little straighter said enough. That father-son moment played out in quiet contrast to the growing chaos outside the cabin walls. In the digital world, Jillian's slap had already gone supernova. The video was spreading like wildfire across every major platform. Hashtags were trending. First-class assault, flying while black, Micah Ellison, Ellison justice. In her solitary seat, Jillian's phone began vibrating so intensely it might as well have been ringing an alarm. Notifications poured in, mentions, texts, emails, screenshots, news alerts. And then a message from her boss. "Saw the video. Is that really Dominic Ellison's son? Meeting's canceled. Don't come to the office Monday. HR will be in touch." 6 hours ago, she'd been rehearsing a career-defining pitch. Now, she was being erased. The plane continued its descent. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers with an announcement more serious than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, upon arrival, we ask that you remain seated while select passengers deplane first. Law enforcement will be meeting the aircraft. We appreciate your cooperation." There were no questions about who they were coming for. The aircraft rolled smoothly to the gate. Passengers watched quietly as 4 uniformed officers stepped into the jetway. After a brief exchange with the chief purser, the lead officer made his way down the aisle. He stopped beside Jillian's seat. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." His tone made it clear. This wasn't optional. Jillian stood slowly, hands trembling as she reached for her bag. Her once imposing suit now looked like a costume, something meant to signal power. now stripped of all meaning. She kept her eyes down as she walked past rows of silent passengers. And then she reached row 3. Micah sat there next to his father. For a brief second she hesitated, perhaps thinking she could still explain, or salvage some part of herself with a final apology. But Dominic's gaze met hers, cold, unmoving, resolute. There would be no forgiveness here. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was accountability. And it had arrived. There were no spin tactics, no high-powered connections to rescue Gillian Wakefield now. As she disappeared into the jetway, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, it was clear. This was no longer a PR issue. It was justice in motion. Back in the cabin, Micah Ellison sat quietly, watching her go. Relief flickered across his face. Yes, but so did something else. A touch of sadness, compassion, even for someone who had shown him none. That was who Micah was. A boy raised not just with wealth, but with values. 20 minutes later, as Dominic and Micah disembarked, they were greeted by something unexpected. Flashing cameras and a crowd of reporters already waiting at the gate. The story had gone far beyond the confines of the plane. Mr. Ellison, is it true your son was assaulted during the flight? Are you pressing charges against Gillian Wakefield? Micah, how are you feeling? Dominic moved smoothly, shielding his son from the swarm with a kind of practiced calm that came from years under public scrutiny. We can confirm that my son was physically assaulted and subjected to racist verbal abuse during the flight, he said. We are cooperating fully with authorities. We ask that our privacy be respected as Micah recovers from this experience. The cameras kept rolling, but neither Dominic nor Micah stopped to give them more. 3 weeks later, the incident had become more than viral. It had sparked a national conversation. A major news anchor stared into the camera. Today, former marketing executive Gillian Wakefield was formally charged with assault on a minor, with an additional hate crime enhancement. The charges stem from a now infamous incident aboard a flight involving the son of billionaire hotel tycoon Dominic Ellison. The news didn't end there. In a related development, the Ellison Hospitality Group has finalized its acquisition of Vera Hotels, Wakefield's former employer. While the merger had long been in discussion, sources suggest the timeline was significantly accelerated following the incident. Meanwhile, across town, an 8-year-old stood at a podium, speaking to a crowd of children and teens gathered for a youth leadership summit. Micah Ellison, no suit, no tie, just quiet confidence. It was scary when it happened, he said, but my dad always tells me, how someone treats you says more about them than it does about you. Nobody has the right to make you feel like you don't belong because of how you look. The room erupted in applause. Many of the young people had seen the video. Now they were seeing the courage behind it. Elsewhere, in a far less glamorous corner of the city, Jillian loaded the last of her belongings into a battered rental truck. Her sleek apartment building loomed behind her, a for rent sign hanging in the window of what had once been her kingdom. The 6-figure job, gone. The high-profile career, destroyed. Legal fees were mounting. Her reputation had become a cautionary tale, shared, reposted, and dissected by millions. All because she had let her prejudice rule her. That evening, in a shimmering ballroom downtown, Dominic Ellison stood before a gathering of hospitality leaders. The occasion? The launch of the Dignity and Service Initiative, aimed at fostering inclusivity in luxury hospitality worldwide. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. True luxury isn't about exclusivity, he said. It's about dignity, about making sure every person who walks through our doors feels seen, respected, safe. The room stood to applaud, many understanding exactly what had inspired this new chapter in Dominic's legacy. 6 months later, another flight, another quiet boarding in first class. Micah, now taller, settled into his seat beside his father. The same aisle, a different feeling entirely. A smiling flight attendant approached. "Mr. Ellison, Micah. It's a pleasure having you with us again. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Micah looked up, a spark of humor in his eyes. "Apple juice, please," he said with a lid. "Just in case." The attendant chuckled. Dominic smiled knowingly. This moment wasn't about what had happened before. It was about what came after. The healing, the strength, the legacy. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Micah stared out the window at the endless sky. What Gillian Wakefield tried to diminish only elevated him. She tried to put him in his place, and in doing so revealed exactly where he belonged, anywhere his dreams could take him.